I'm going to explain a supernatural show called Dead Like Me. No spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. The show opens with an introduction to our protagonist, George, who is an 18-year-old girl. She has recently dropped out of college, as she has no will to study or work. George has no friends either, and prepares to stay at home and do nothing all day. This immensely irritates her mother, Joy, who advises her to do something with her life. As a result, they constantly argue and have a very strained relationship. Apart from her mom, George lives with her dad, Clancy, and her little sister, Reggie. She considers Reggie invisible to her because they have nothing in common except they both have bisexual names and are particularly close. One morning, George is woken up by her mother, who forces her to leave the house and find work. With no other choice, she heads to the employment agency, where she meets an official named Dolores. The woman looks at her resume and informs George that she can't find a job since she has no work experience or proper education. Dolores also advises her to stop looking so miserable and smile if she wants to go far in life. But George is offended by the comment, and she rudely insults the woman, saying she hasn't gotten very far in life herself. This enrages Dolores so much that she sends the girl to the basement to work as a file clerk. George later learns from a coworker that Dolores only assigns this job to people she truly hates. Following this, George spends the rest of the day avoiding work, frequently retreating to the bathroom to listen to music. She soon realizes she's not the only one slacking off, as everyone else is either playing video games or smoking. As the days go on, George becomes increasingly careless in her duties, and she even loses a few files. However, instead of trying to find them, she simply shrugs it off and doesn't bother looking. During lunch, George steps outside to eat, and after she's finished, she heads back to the office. Meanwhile, the news reports that a Russian space station is falling into the Pacific Ocean, as expected, but some debris, including a zero-gravity toilet seat, has broken off early and is about to land on the west coast of the US. On her way, a stranger approaches our girl and asks if her name is George. She ignores him, but the man stops her again and mentions her middle name, which shocks her. Feeling creeped out, George proceeds to walk away, but he manages to touch her hair and leave eerie marks. Then, all of a sudden, the zero-gravity toilet from the space station falls off and strikes her hard. It causes an explosion and people start running frantically for their lives. Moments later, George stands up, confused, as she seems perfectly fine after what happened. But soon she is approached by a man named Rube and his accomplice Betty. They inform her that she's dead and welcome her to the afterlife. At this moment, George finally notices her dead body and is filled with shock. She refuses to accept her death, insisting that she's too young to die. However, Betty shuts her down, saying she did nothing meaningful with her life anyway. The duo then introduces themselves as the Grim Reapers, who are tasked with taking souls from the dead and guiding them to the afterlife. After that, they take George to see her autopsy at the hospital, where her face is barely recognizable. George is shaken by the sight, but she's even more depressed at the fact that the first person to touch her naked body is a coroner. The scene then cuts to a few days later, where George accompanies the Grim Reapers to her own funeral. There, she notices her mother devastated by her death, which shocks her because they were constantly fighting when she was alive. But what hurts her the most is seeing the sad state of her younger sister, who she had always ignored. During the funeral, George discovers that although people can't see her, they can perfectly see Rube. He then explains that being a Grim Reaper comes with some privileges. One of them is that he can live among the people and interact with them. "You think that coroner touched a lot of bodies," says Rube. After the funeral, George goes to a cafe with the Grim Reapers and asks why she hasn't gone to heaven or hell yet. Rube explains that they have a special task for her, and she will become a Grim Reaper, just like them. He reveals that each Grim Reaper must pass on a certain number of souls before being promoted. It turns out that the man who touched George before her death was also a Grim Reaper. Oh, and she was his last soul. Since he got promoted and left the job, George will have to replace him now. She will have to remain on Earth for the time being and be given a physical body. However, her face will look look different to the living people, although she will appear the same to the dead ones. George is annoyed by the idea of another job, but she has no choice but to accept her fate. In the next scene, they arrive at a roadside and witness a death, in which a Grim Reaper named Roxy reaps someone who died from a piano falling on her head. At this moment, George notices a small creature moving through the building and asks what it is. Rube then explains that it's called a graveling, a creature that causes accidents like these and helps fulfill the destiny of things. However, he warns her that it's best not to bother them, as they have their own role in the balance of life and death. Next, Rube introduces George to another Grim Reaper named Mason, who has just finished reaping 2 dead drug addicts. Rube then orders Mason to find an apartment for George and also asks him to teach her their ways. It turns out the Grim Reapers move into the houses of dead people and only leave when another human shifts in there. As a result, Mason takes her to an apartment where a group of criminals has recently been massacred. George is scared by the sight of all the brutalized dead bodies, but Mason isn't fazed. He then begins robbing the dead criminals, which weirds her out. However, Mason explains that Grim Reapers aren't paid for their work, so they have to rob the dead to get by. Over the next few days, George hangs out with the other Grim Reapers and watches them as they take other people's souls. After some time passes, Rube gives her her first mission. She must take the soul of a passenger named Christy on a train. He then informs her that the death will be very violent, so it would be better for her to put on a seatbelt. Upon arriving at the train, George gets to her designated seat and a middle-aged woman walks in. She assumes the woman is Christy and feels bad for her, thinking her life has to end so soon. However, seconds later, a little girl walks in and George notices a graveling in the distance, growling at her. This finally makes her realize that Christy is actually the little girl who just walked in. Soon, the train starts moving and the time of her death draws closer. George tries to touch Christy to take her soul, but she feels terrible and can't bring herself to do it. She thus approaches the little girl and tries to engage in conversation. George suggests she move to another seat, but just then, a guard appears and interrupts their conversation. He forbids George from speaking with Christy, who is traveling without her parents and is in the care of the train staff. But at this moment, the train suddenly goes off course and crashes down a slope through the woods. As chaos erupts among the passengers, George quickly grabs Christy and desperately tries to save her. When the train finally comes to rest, the train guard approaches the wreckage and surveys the scene. He is relieved to learn that everyone survived the violent crash, including Christy, who is protected by George. Next, the survivors stay in the woods, awaiting help, and George notices Rube in the distance. She approaches him and he immediately scolds her for failing to do her job. George explains that she couldn't do it because Christy is just a little girl with a long life ahead of her. However, Rube responds that everyone must face death and her fate is already written. He warns her that if the child doesn't die, her soul will begin rotting inside of her body, causing her only to suffer. George then pleads with Rube to do it himself, but he responds that since the task is assigned to her, only she can do it. With a heavy heart, George then returns to Christy and asks her to close her eyes. The little girl obeys, after which George takes her soul and condemns her to death. The other passengers are terrified by what they witness, but George walks away to join Rube in the woods. The two then meet Christy's soul, and seconds later, a path of light appears before them. It turns out to be the door to heaven, where the little girl joyfully walks in. Meanwhile, the two Grim Reapers watch tearfully as she disappears into the light. The scene then cuts to Joy's house, where she receives a visit from her neighbor. It turns out that her little daughter Reggie has been telling others that her mom doesn't allow her to use the restroom. Furious, Joy closes the door and immediately confronts Reggie about why she's spreading lies like this. The girl calmly responds that she only said it so that her neighbors would let her use their bathroom. Hearing this, Joy is appalled and warns her not to repeat it, as she could get arrested for abusing her daughter. Days later, Joy receives a call from Reggie's school, informing her that the girl has been stealing toilet seats. This pushes the woman over the edge, and she ends up scolding Reggie brutally. She also informs her husband about the situation and suggests they consult a child psychologist. However, Reggie refuses to see a therapist, so her supportive dad assures her that it won't force her into it. He also tells Joy that he disagrees with her harsh approach, which sparks a heated argument between the couple. On the other hand, George is still struggling to adjust to her new life. She feels that her job is very cruel, as she doesn't want to cause suffering to others. She thus decides to quit and doesn't show up at the usual meeting of the Grim Reapers. After she fails to appear, Rube arrives at her apartment to talk to her, but George decides not to open the door and tries to make him think that she isn't home. Moments later, Rube gets tired of waiting, so she simply leaves the next name on the death list and walks away, but George refuses to touch the sheet, convincing herself that it isn't her problem. She then spends the day watching television, trying to forget what she's supposed to do. In the evening, the time comes for another person to die, and a graveling visits her, but despite everything, George simply ignores it and decides to go to sleep. The next day, she gets a note on her door demanding rent from the landlord. This stuns George, and she realizes that if she doesn't pay it, she'll be kicked out soon. Desperate, she approaches Mason for advice, and together they try to steal money from the traffic meters, but their plan is foiled when they are interrupted by Roxy, who attempts to run them over with a truck. At this point, Betty also arrives and informs George that Rube has summoned her to the morgue. We are then taken to the morgue, where the Grim Reapers inform the coroner that they are the deceased's relatives and request privacy. After that, Rube shows George the body of the deceased man that she was supposed to reap yesterday. She states that he's dead anyway, so the mission is accomplished whether she did it or not. However, Rube informs her that she didn't free his soul. It is still trapped inside the body, causing him to suffer. She then asks her to touch him, and George has no choice but to oblige. As soon as she does so, the man's soul is freed, and he thanks the Grim Reapers, saying he had been in great distress in his dead body. After this, Rube explains to George that without them, souls would be trapped indefinitely, and it is her fault that the man suffered so long. He also states that this is her job, and she can't avoid her responsibility forever. Rube then advises her to find something she loves in this world and hold on to it, so that she'll have a reason to keep going. Later, George misses her family so much that she goes to see them outside her old house. At the same time, Joy gets another visit from a neighbor who reveals that Reggie has stolen another toilet seat. Joy becomes enraged and rushes to scold her daughter, but she is nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, George spots her sister sneaking out the window with a backpack and decides to follow her. She soon arrives in front of a large tree and is shocked to discover that Reggie has been hoarding all the stolen toilet seats in honor of George. This makes her feel deeply guilty, and she regrets not being there for her sister in the past. Determined to make things right, George decides to stay on Earth and do whatever she can to help Reggie. The next morning, she shows up at the employment agency and meets Dolores again. This time, she takes a different approach and speaks to the woman with a friendly smile. Dolores is impressed by her charm and offers her a good job as an office secretary. The episode then concludes with George finally embracing her new life, fake smiling for misogynists all day and taking on a new identity under the name Mildred.